And welcome to the basics of program design. This is the part of our semester where we delve into the practical applications of many of the things that we've talked about thus far. And to that point, what we've talked about so far is the why. Right? We've talked about what causes muscle hypertrophy, what causes somebody to become a good endurance athlete. So we've talked about things like ribosomal biogenesis. We've talked about things like mitochondrial biogenesis. We've talked about things like satellite cell activation, proliferation. We've talked about AKT and mTOR activation, phosphorylation. That's a lot of the basic science why. And it takes a long time to appreciate those things before it's appropriate to move on, especially at the grad level. If this were undergrad level, we might have cut into some of these concepts I'm going to talk about now a bit earlier. But at the grad level, it's expected that we go a lot deeper with the why before getting into the how and the what. So the how and the what of today is basics of program design, the acute program variables, if you will. The first things that you have to take into account when you're making a resistance training program for somebody. And to that point, I do want to make one point here. We're going to be talking about resistance training programs. We will not spend time on aerobic resistance training programs. And the reason is because aerobic training programs could be an entire semester's worth of class in of itself. So for the time that we have left, and what I deem appropriate for this curriculum, we're going to talk about resistance training programs. And so with that, I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorite characters for talking about exercise. And that is Danny McBride's character from Eastbound and Down, a great HBO show. And in this particular exchange here, he's denigrating CrossFit. I play real sports, he says, not trying to be the best at exercising. You've heard me denigrate CrossFit more than once. And one of the reasons is that they don't do programming. Most of the CrossFit gyms that you see don't do programming. At least they don't do it appropriately. So today's lecture is talking about the stuff that CrossFit does not do. The reason that I don't like CrossFit can be owed to the things that I'm going to talk about today, the things that you need to take into account in order to make a resistance training program effective. So today we're going to talk about the needs analysis. We're going to identify critical program variables, the acute program variables. Those acute program variables are abbreviated COVIRP, COFIVRP. We'll understand the concept of specificity. We'll define progressive overload. And then toward the end, I'm going to introduce you to what's called the 4x4 matrix, which was developed by my master's mentor, and it makes it really, really easy to prescribe resistance-based exercise. So first, the needs analysis. We've got our shot putter over here. We've also got a marathoner over here. These are two athletes. They are different morphologically, that is to say that their bodies look and do function differently. And they need different things out of their body. This guy, the shot putter, needs to act on the field of play quite a bit differently than this guy. So when you look at needs analysis, the whole point is to, number one, analyze. Analyze what? Well, you're analyzing the need that this guy has on the field. So he needs to what? He needs to move fast. He needs to be explosive. He also needs to be strong. He needs to have a great amount of rotational torque. He needs to, in a very ordered chain of events, be able to develop force and transfer force from his lower body to his upper body, all the way to that little shot put, right? He also needs to be big, right? We know that the bigger shot putters tend to be better. And just a funny aside, when I was in high school, when I was in 11th grade, I started to lift weights. And here's the thing that happened. I got overly confident. I was also a track runner. And so in 11th grade, I'd been lifting weights for about a month, and it was time to go out for track practice. And who did I group myself with? Feeling nice and confident from the month worth of weightlifting? The shot putters. That's right. I grouped myself with the throwers for some reason, because I thought that I was big. I was at least walking tall in my head. So this guy needs something very different. He needs to stress different energy pathways, right? He needs to stress the creatine phosphate pathway. This athlete over here needs to be able to impart economic power. Economic power. That is, he needs to be able to impart power for a very long period of time, and thus must be very efficient with his movements. He needs to stress oxidative phosphorylation. So his mitochondria need to be very developed. He's got to have big ones and lots of them. Right? He also needs to be relatively light on his feet. He does not want to be the same size as the shot putter. These are all things that the strength coach has to analyze. They have to analyze the morphology of the athlete, as well as what's needed within the field of play. Is it a fast sport? Is it a slow sport? Is it explosive? Is it not explosive? Is it endurance? Is it high intensity, low intensity? Long duration, short duration? What energy system does it stress? Where do they develop power? For how long do they have to develop power? Next, we use that information to design and develop the resistance training program. So this is where you take all of that information that you've analyzed and you begin to develop your exercise program. Then you implement it. Then you evaluate it. Did it work? Did it increase their performance? Chances are it did, but you can always tweak it. Therefore, you analyze again. Has the athlete changed? Has this shot putter changed over the course of the season? So that maybe next season he expects to be, a bit more muscular or a bit more powerful. This guy expects to be a little bit better at his kick at the end, or a little bit better at pacing overall. That requires you to design and develop a little bit differently, right? And so on we go, constantly analyzing, designing, developing, implementing, and evaluating. This is something that you guys will need to do for your project. The very first thing you'll need to do is you'll have to make a needs analysis on your athlete, or on your subject in general. So that's to say you'll have to analyze their height, their weight, the thing they hope to get out of their exercise program. If it's an athlete, what type of athlete? Do they want to get bigger, stronger, faster? Do they want to increase stamina? What type of movements do they do in their sport or activity? Is it fast movement, slow movement over a long period of time? These are all of the things that you'll need to analyze with your subject for your project. So those acute program variables then that KOVRP, choice, order, frequency, intensity, volume, rest, and progression. So the choice of exercise, the order of the exercises, the frequency to which you work out, the intensity of the load, the volume of lifting, the rest periods in between sets and in between exercises, and finally, how fast or slow are you going to progress? So let's get to the C first, exercise choice. Whether you're doing bands, or machines, or dumbbells, or multi-joint free weights, or Olympic lifts, explosive lifts, there are a lot of different types of exercises to choose from. So the question is, when do you use bands? Should the shot putter use bands? Should the shot putter use multi-joint machines? Should he focus on single joint movements? Should he focus on multi-joint movements? Should he focus on explosive movements. If you are a good strength coach, believe it or not, you'd probably include all of these types of things into the shot putter's exercise routine. You'd also probably include all of these things into the marathon runner's regimen. And here's an example. That shot putter, you might kind of like laugh at the bands here. I know that I do. Ha 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 ha. But the reality is that what if he has a rotator cuff tear or an impingement, and now he's got a rehab? Well, you're going to use TheraBands. We know that. The majority of his exercise program is going to be in here. He's going to be doing things like squats and things like snatch, right? The marathon runner, if he or she has valgus knees, you might have them do squats with a TheraBand around their knees. But I can tell you that research indicates with marathon runners, guess what they should be doing? This stuff. Heavy lifting and Olympic lifting, explosive lifting. That's actually what increases running economy in endurance runners. Okay, so exercise order. Generally speaking, you perform large muscle group exercises first within any given workout session before you hit small group exercises. That should make sense. And along those same lines, you'll also perform your multi-joint exercises before single joint. These two concepts are, of course, related. So if you have a particular workout session in which you're doing, let's say, squats, deadlifts, bench presses, bicep curls, and my favorite thing of all time, calf raises, you wouldn't want to lead off with calf raises. You wouldn't want to lead off with bicep curls. You'd want to do squats first, deadlifts first, bench presses first, before getting into the small muscle, single joint types of things like bicep curls and calf raises. And we commonly alternate between upper and lower body exercises as well. This is if you're doing a particular session in which you're doing total body lifts. So that session, you want to hit all your muscle groups, right? Which would be the opposite of doing something like a split routine where you're choosing to, prioritize one muscle group just for that day. So if you do a resistance training session in which you're doing whole body, you want to target whole body, one of the effective things that you can do is alternate between upper and lower body exercises. This is going from squats to bench press to deadlift to lat pull, things like that. If you have a main priority of stressing power training, it's always best to perform total body exercises. And you can perform power movements in just about any type of movement, even on the leg extension. But to maximize peak power and the rate of velocity development, total body exercises are best. So that could be like box jumps. It could be plyometric push-ups. It could be things like hang cleans or power snatches or high pulls. Any of those total body power movements. So if you take a look at this example here, the only thing I really want you to focus on for this table here are the exercises right here. Don't look at anything else. So he's got half squats, bench presses, deadlifts, shoulder presses, calf presses, lat pull downs, weight crunches, shoulder shrugs. How does that look to you? That look good? Good. It shouldn't. Number one, what he means by half squats, I think, is parallel squats, where you go down to where the femurs are parallel to the floor. That's what I think he means. That's what typically people mean when they say half squats. But something that should jump out, to me, always, calf presses. Why do we do them? I don't know. There is no research to back up their effectiveness at all. So number one, I would take out calf presses altogether. I would also move shoulder shrugs up above weighted crunches if I had my druthers. Other than that, it's not a terrible order. Okay, let's move on to loading. The I in the coverb. So in simple terms, intensity is the amount of weight lifted, right? Or the load. If you put 100 pounds on a bar, that 100 pounds is the load that you're lifting, right? And it depends on other acute program variables. And we'll see what that means in a few minutes here. It's inversely related to exercise volume. And it's typically prescribed as a percent of 1 RM or RM load. So here's the thing about intensity. If you can bench press 100 pounds for your 1 repetition maximum, I'm probably not going to prescribe you your 100% 1RM load, but I might prescribe you 70% of your 1RM load, so like 70 pounds. Or I might prescribe you 80% or 90% of your 1RM load, so 80 or 90 pounds. There may be times where we do singles, where we actually practice doing 1RMs. So we can express intensity with a percentage of the 1RM. The other common way that you see intensity expressed within resistance training programs is the RM load. So in this example, you're bench pressing 100 pounds. So the 1 RM load is 100 pounds. Well, what if you wanted to do an amount of weight, or what if you wanted to do a load that corresponded to your 8 repetition maximum? And that would usually be about 80% of the 1 RM. Right? So the RM concept corresponds to the amount of load, the load that you can do for that exact number of repetitions, and no more and no less. So 8 RM would be the load that allows you to do 8 repetitions, not 9 repetitions, not 7 repetitions, but 8, exactly 8, where the 8th repetition is your absolute last repetition. How do you know what that load is? How do you know what somebody's 8 RM load is? A lot of it's trial and error. Right? If they do a 1 RM and it's 100 pounds, it may take a little bit of practice to get to what their load would be for an 8 RM. There are easy charts as well that the NSCA puts out in which you can easily find corresponding loads based on RM loads or RM numbers. So for instance, 10 RM loads correspond to 75% of the 1 RM. We know that. 8 RM loads correspond to about 80% of the 1 RM. Right? 6 RM loads correspond to about 85% of the 1 RM. 4 RM loads correspond to about 90% of the 1 RM. So we know these things, they're not quite set in stone. There is a little bit of fluidity. But generally speaking, when you make your exercise program, you're going to be prescribing intensity as either a percentage of the 1 RM or in RM load numbers. I will say that by and large, people prescribe as percentage of the 1 RM. There aren't that many people that I know who actually prescribe in RM load. Right? So you're just going to say, well, week 1, you're working out at an intensity of 80% of your 1 RM. So every exercise you do, I want you to do at 80% of your 80% of your 1 RM. Right? The next week, I want you to work out at 95% of your 1 RM. I want you to get heavy. So that means every exercise you do, you're going to do it at 95% of your 1 RM. Pretty heavy loads. Now, volume which is inversely related to intensity, is typically expressed as the number of sets that you perform multiplied by the number of repetitions within each set. So, for example, when you write out volume in your program, you might write it as 3 by 10, or 4 by 12, or 2 by 4. So this would be 3 sets of 10 repetitions, 4 sets of 12 repetitions, 2 sets of 4 repetitions. And if I was to ask you which one of these, 3 by 10, 4 by 12, 2 by 4, is the heaviest, the highest intensity, you would of course say 2 by 4. Right? 2 by 4, 2 sets of 4 repetitions. The way that you would know that is look at this number here, 4 repetitions. That means they were doing a load that only allowed them to do 4 repetitions, which equates to about 90% of their 1RM. In this volumized program, the person was doing 4 sets of 12 repetitions. 12 repetitions. So they were doing a weight that allowed them to do 12 repetitions within each set, which corresponds to about 70% of their 1RM. Right? And then 3 by 10. They did 3 sets of 10 repetitions. They were doing a load that allowed them to do 10 repetitions within each set. And 10 repetitions corresponds to about 75% of their 1RM. Volume can be manipulated by a few things, so like the number of exercises, the number of sets per exercise, the number of repetitions per set. What's important to understand is that increased metabolic and hormonal responses are often associated with high training volume. So if you increase the number of exercises per workout session, if you increase the number of sets per exercise, if you increase the number of repetitions per set, you're going to increase the training volume. And typically with high training volume comes increased metabolic and hormonal adaptation. So if you're interested in increasing testosterone release or growth hormone release, those hormones, their levels, their secretion levels are associated with higher volume training. This article, Delorme and Watkins from 1945, was one of the first articles that really showed us the importance of stressing exercise training volume. And they popularized the concept of doing 3 sets of 10 repetitions, which is commonly what basically we all do when we're feeling lazy at the gym. And the concept, of course, is you do 3 sets, and on your first set, you're doing a load that corresponds to 50% of your 10 RM load. So if your 10 RM load, the load that allows you to do 10 repetitions is 100 pounds, let's say, on the first set, you're doing 50 pounds for 10 repetitions. On the second set, you're doing 75 pounds for 10 repetitions. And finally, on the third set, you're doing 100 pounds for 10 repetitions. So this concept of basically, laddering, sometimes folks call it laddering, where you are systematically, slowly, progressively increasing the weight as you go set by set. And what we understand, or what we've learned from this, is that adaptations are more potent when you do multiple sets. And believe it or not, when the first science studied resistance training, the first science that we learned dictated single set training. So the first studies surrounding exercise science, looking at resistance training, they popularized the notion of single set training. Well, you do a set of bench press, or you do a set of curls, or you do a set of squats. And then you go home and you eat bacon and eggs for 10 hours. What we learned is one set is good, but multiple sets is just better. Adaptations like stamina, adaptations like strength become more robust when you do more than one set. So as the science developed around strength training, we began to understand that adaptation really only was maximized when you do more than one set. And this is why it's very important to understand how to correctly prescribe training volume, because volume can dictate adaptation, just as exercise intensity can drive adaptation. So if you look at exercise intensity and exercise volume, note the inverse relationship here along this spectrum. Here's the number of repetitions on the spectrum from 1 to 25. If you are interested, if your exercise goal is to increase strength and power, then you'd prescribe loads that correspond to about 1 to 6. So you'd prescribe 6 RM loads or less, which means very high weight. Right? If you were interested, if the workout goal was to increase muscular stamina or muscular endurance, you'd prescribe loads of 15 RM or greater, right? Or very light loads. And so you can see this inverse relationship between exercise intensity and volume. Low volume is tied to high weight, right? High loads over here are always done in low volume. Right? A 6 RM, a load that can only be performed for 6 repetitions, is a heavy load, but you can only do it for 6 repetitions, right? Low volume. A 20 RM is a light load. It's a load that you can do for 20 repetitions. Right? So it's high volume. Low load, high volume. Right? Hypertrophy kind of is in the middle here. There is quite a bit of controversy about where hypertrophy fits in within the spectrum. For many, many years, it was thought to fit between this sort of 8 to 12 repetition range, where you're performing loads that correspond to 8 RM to 12 RM. So kind of not super heavy, but not super light. Not minimal volume, but not maximal volume. Okay, so the R. I am going to take some time to talk about rest. And the reason is that oftentimes rest is the most neglected acute training variable of all. So what I want you to understand is that responses to short rest intervals are really potent. There's an elevated heart rate, which you guys already experienced earlier in the semester, which leads to increased subjective ratings of perceived exertion. There's increased lactate, testosterone, and HGH concentrations in response to short rest intervals. But we also know that there's reduced performance during subsequent sets. All of these things are incredibly important to understand within the realm of the acute program variable prescription. Intensity is, yes, the king of the acute variables. So the amount of load that you are subjecting the individual to, right? That's really the primary driver of muscular adaptation in a resistance training program. But what rest allows for is a maximizing of that adaptation. So you can prescribe a nice heavy load, thinking that, yeah, this heavy load's going to increase strength, man. I'm having this person do 4RM loads or heavier, right? 4RM, 3RM, 2RM. And with that, I think they're going to get really, really strong and really, really big. And that's great. The problem is that if you don't understand how to rest that person correctly in between sets of those 4RM loads and 3RM loads, their adaptation that you're hoping for, that strength, that hypertrophy, it's not going to happen. At least it's not going to happen optimally. So rest really determines the potency of the adaptation. So if you look at this diagram here, this is showing a theoretical response to high intensity interval training, HIIT training, with relatively long rest. Specifically, this is showing a 1:6 work to rest ratio. If you guys remember from exercise physiology, for high intensity activity, the creatine phosphate system is the energy pathway that provides ATP. Right? In order to resynthesize ATP in very high intensity, short duration activities, the creatine phosphate enzyme becomes highly active. And so ensuring that the cell has enough creatine phosphate is of utmost importance in order to ensure maximal performance during high intensity interval training types of things, or anything that's high intensity, I should say. And so what you can see here is that if you exercise, you do a high intensity bout of a sprint, right? Like a 30-second sprint. We know that creatine phosphate levels will deplete in the muscle, right? But if you rest, creatine phosphate levels will recover. And if you rest long enough, you can get to a point where creatine phosphate levels do indeed almost fully recover before the next set. So you do your second set and you deplete creatine phosphate in the muscle, but then you rest again. And if you rest long enough, creatine phosphate levels will recover to fairly high levels. And then you'll do your next set. So what you're seeing is that as long as you rest long enough, creatine phosphate levels will replete in the muscle, leaving you at a high level of preparedness, physiological preparedness for the next set. You need phosphocreatine in order to resynthesize ATP during this sprint. Note here, the sprint is 30 seconds. The rest is 3 minutes. Right? The 1:6 work ratio. So the question is, what happens if rest ratios are short? Well, let's use the same type of concept, high intensity interval training, but let's do a 1:2 work to rest interval. So here's your sprint. You're going to deplete intramuscular creatine phosphate levels, but this time we're going to cut short the rest. And then I'm going to make you sprint again. And you're going to deplete. And I'm going to let you rest, but not for long. And then I'm going to make you sprint again. So the question is, how do you think performance is going to compare in this example compared to this example? There are 3 sprints here. 1, 2, 3. There are 3 sprints here. I would venture a guess that sprint number 1 probably equal performance between the 1:2 work to rest ratio and the 1:6 work to rest ratio. But by sprint number 2, note here that in the 1:2 work rest ratio, creatine phosphate has only recovered about 50% of its resting value. And of course, we need optimal levels of intramuscular creatine phosphate in order to resynthesize ATP for this next high-intensity sprint. So I would theorize that the second and third sprint, performance-wise, is a lot worse than it was in the 1-to-6 work-to-rest ratio regimen. This is important stuff for track coaches to understand, especially with their sprinters. If they want to maximize speed, all-out speed, not the ability to recover for the next event, but they want to maximize speed in their sprinter, in their 100-meter sprinter, 200-meter sprinter. Which work-to-rest ratio routine do you think would be best? The answer, based upon research, clearly is 1-to-6, because it allows for greater creatine phosphate recovery, leaving the athlete at a greater level of physiological preparedness for the next set. In this study, they did something really interesting. They did 6 4-second bicycle sprints with 21 seconds of recovery between each sprint set. And then there were 2 groups. There was an active recovery group and a passive recovery group. The active recovery group kept biking at 32% of their VO2 max during the rest periods, during the 21-second rest periods, whereas the passive recovery group just sat on the bike and chilled for 21 seconds. Notice here how high the intensity is. 4-second sprints. That's going to be supramaximal intensity. So here's the 6 sets. Here's power output on the bike. And you can see that both groups decreased in power output from set 1 to 6. But what you note, if you look, is that by the 6th set, the passive recovery group in blue was better able to maintain power output. What can we chalk that up to? Probably the fact that they were better able to recover creatine phosphate in between sets. Why? Because they were doing passive recovery. They were no longer contracting their muscles, therefore allowing their mitochondria the ability to recover phosphocreatine. The active recovery group was still contracting their muscles during recovery. It might have been light, but they were still contracting, which means that the ATP that was being produced by the mitochondria during the rest periods, it was not just going toward phosphocreatine repletion. It had to also go toward feeding the sarcomere, unfortunately, because they're still contracting. So the mitochondria in the active group still had to budget some of the mitochondrial ATP for muscle contraction, whereas the passive recovery group did not have to budget mitochondrial ATP for muscle contraction because they weren't contracting. They could instead use all that mitochondrial ATP to rephosphorylate creatine to creatine phosphate. Check out lactate removal during recovery. Here's passive recovery, here's active recovery, and then here's active recovery at a low intensity. And you see something kind of different. Blood lactate is on the y-axis here. In the passive recovery group, blood lactate remained somewhat high. In the moderate intensity active recovery, it was reduced. And in the low intensity active recovery, it was reduced even more. So in terms of lactate, we see something a bit different than we see with creatine phosphate. And it's that your body's a little bit better to dispose of lactate when mitochondria are turned on a little bit more. So since you're actively recovering, your mitochondria's activity levels are still elevated, meaning they can oxidize lactate, which allows for a better disappearance of lactate, a better metabolism of lactate. And you can see that the low intensity is even better than moderate intensity. So moderate intensity, there's probably still a little bit too much contraction going on. With low intensity, the mitochondria are on just enough to metabolize optimal amounts of lactate. Right? Okay, let's move on to frequency, the F in COFERP. So in terms of training frequency, we define it as the number of training sessions performed during a specific period. One important thing to note is that 2 or 3 sessions per week is often appropriate to stimulate some adaptation for folks who are untrained. That's different than if you're trained. If you're highly trained, you need more than just 2 or 3 sessions per week to maintain adaptation or to gain adaptation. So if you're like this guy or this girl guy, you've got to lift most likely every single day. But if you're this guy, which is basically me today, you only need 1 or 2 times per week and you'll be fine. Here's an example of basically a couple things, actually. So workout A and workout B, they each have different frequencies of training. They also have a different way of structuring exercises. So workout A, you're lifting on Mondays and on Thursdays. Workout B, you're exercising on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. I'm going to point out a couple things. Number one, do you think that the order of these lifts is sufficient? I would say yes. I think it makes sense. Back squat, deadlift, bench press, lat pull. You're basically going from the most multi-joint core lifts to lifts that are somewhat less multi-joint. Workout B, you're seeing what's called a split routine. A split routine where they have basically divided lower body and upper body. And so the exercises are back squat, deadlift, leg extension, leg curl. Right? Good lifts for a leg workout, properly ordered from multi-joint, big musculature, to single joint, small musculature. On the upper body day, you've got bench press, lat pull, arm extension, arm curl. Maybe not the best in terms of exercise choice. This could be somebody who is just a beginner, maybe a beginner/intermediate. But what they do show is how you are doing each of these workouts 2 times per week. So you're doing the lower body on Monday and Thursday. You're doing the upper body on Tuesday and Friday. So at least in both of these workouts, the choice of exercise is fairly good, somewhat basic, but good, at least fundamental. They've hit upon the fundamental lifts, and they're ordered correctly. And then in workout B, you're seeing an example of split routining, where you are targeting a particular musculature, particular muscle groups on each workout session. Now, to that point of split routines, here's a little bit more of an advanced version where you've got Monday and Thursday, your upper body days, and then Tuesday and Friday, your lower body days. This is indeed a common way to split. And you can see the exercises that they've chosen: bench press, bent over row, dumbbell press, tricep extension, curls. In the lower body, squat, RDLs, leg extension, leg curl, standing calf raise, abs, lying leg raise, crunches. And they've got them a couple days a week. There is some variation in the exercises as well if you look. So Tuesday's lower body is a little bit different from Friday's lower body. Monday's upper body is a little bit different than Thursday's upper body, which is always good. This is definitely more of an intermediate level, maybe intermediate to advanced level. Here's another this is a very common way to structure single muscle group split routines. I would say that this is probably one of the most popular ways to do single muscle group split routines. Monday's chest. What else? Tuesday, back. Wednesday, shoulders. Thursday, quads. Friday, arms. Saturday, glutes, hamstring, calves. Sunday, 1 day of rest, thank goodness. This type of split routine regimen is used commonly amongst bodybuilders, where they really want to focus on their chest and tries on one session. And so for 3 hours, they will do nothing but bench presses and chest presses and tricep push downs. And on Tuesdays, they want to focus nothing except for on their back and their big, juicy biceps. And so they'll be in there for 3 hours doing that. And so this type of split routine really allows you to spend quite a bit of time on individual muscle groups. And in fact, that is kind of the point of split routining, is that conceptually it allows you to spend more time per week dedicated to particular muscle groups. So by splitting lower body and upper body over here, you're able to fit in more lower body exercises per week. And you're able to fit in more upper body exercises per week than you would if you did whole body in each of these 4 workouts. Over here, there's even more concentration, where you can fit in even more work, more physical work, more volume. So split routines definitely do have a place. It allows you to sometimes move a little bit more efficiently through the week. And if you look at resistance training frequency based on the competitive season, there are 4 basic phases to the competitive season: off-season, preseason, in-season, and post-season. And the off-season is where you're training the most frequently. It's where you're trying to regain the things that you might have lost when you take a few weeks off immediately following competition. So in the off-season, you're just getting back into it, trying to regain. Preseason, 3 to 4 times a week. In-season, postseason, the fewest. Now, here's the thing to remember. And intensity and volume are related to all of this. You need to remember that in the off-season, intensity is going to be somewhat low. Volume of training is going to be high. So not only are you training those days a week, but every time you do train, the load is somewhat light, and the volume is then somewhat high. Whereas in season, not only are you not training very many times per week in the gym, but when you do, exercise intensity is going to be quite high. The loads are going to be quite high, and thus, training volume is going to be low. This is structured in such a way so that you reach the adaptation that you want without injury, so that you can peak at the right time of the season, which would be the end of the season. We structure sports-specific resistance training programs in such a way so that you peak right at the end of the season. Why? Well, because as a coach, we assume that your team's going to make the playoffs. We assume you're good at what you do. And so we don't want you peaking after the first game, because then it's all downhill from there. What we want you to do is peak right at the beginning of the postseason. Hit the postseason hot. Top of the game. We want you top of the game. We want all of your muscular adaptations to be maximized right at the beginning of the postseason. We've talked about this before. How does muscle action fit into acute program variables? Well, we know that concentric and eccentric actions are what define muscle contraction. And don't forget that eccentric actions are really what maximize strength. But in sports, you don't just move eccentrically, you also move concentrically. So as a part of the needs analysis, you would never just say, oh, this sport is all eccentric. It's all deceleration, all eccentric. No, sports, they're all concentric and eccentric. So you can't forget both. But what I will stress is that really don't forget phases or sessions in which you would stress eccentrics. Why do you want to stress eccentrics? Because as I alluded to just a moment ago, that's deceleration. Whenever you're decelerating in a sport, you are acting eccentrically. And you want to be good at decelerating because then you are able to avoid injury. That'd be sweet if I had a echo thing. And so especially when we train female athletes, we really like to stress eccentric training when we can, to train deceleration, to avoid knee injuries. Repetition velocity is also important to take into consideration because most sports, with the exception perhaps of endurance sports, maximal power is actually what decides performance. Folks who are more powerful as soccer players, more powerful as football players, typically perform better. How long is your toe on the soccer ball when you kick it? Just for a moment. So it's the goal then to impart not only as much force on the ball as you can, but as much force as fast as possible onto that ball. Because your toe only gets a moment of contact with the ball. So you want to be able to enforce maximal force and in a very, very, very quick moment of time onto that ball. Something like the javelin, high power. High power. Javelin is somewhat light. And that throwing motion is a very, 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 very fast stride. It's all about imparting as much force, but doing it as fast as possible onto that javelin. In fact, if you look at power training, and you look at the force velocity curve, which we've seen before, here's the force velocity curve as we know it before training in purple and after training. And what this is saying is that effective power training essentially allows you to impart more force at every velocity after power training. You're able to impart more force onto the implement at every velocity of movement. That means kicking the ball harder, throwing the javelin further, throwing the shot put further, throwing the ball further, hitting the guy harder, sending him through the ropes. And if you look over here to the right, what we typically see here in black, the black line is that classic force velocity curve. And in blue is what we think of as peak power curve, the peak power curve, in which peak power up here is reached at a level that corresponds to 1/3 maximal force and 1/3 maximal velocity of contraction. So peak power traditionally is seen as basically a concession, a balance between imparting force and velocity, because power is not just about imparting force. It's about imparting force as fast as you can. And so peak power is realized at a fraction of maximal force. And the reason is so that you can maximize velocity as well. I should say so that you can maximize velocity equally to force, 1/3 of each. So for single joint movements, that is true. Right? It is true that peak power is reached at about 1/3 force, 1/3 velocity. For multi-joint movements, there is some movement, I should say, in the research. We are not sold on this curve in terms of multi-joint movements. Things like, like bicycling, or even squatting, or Olympic lifting, or swimming, very multi-joint movements. We are not sold in research right now that this curve is the best depiction of the relationship between force and velocity, as well as where peak velocity is achieved within that curve. And here's what I mean. Sarich in 2015 found that for multi-joint movements, like those during swimming and volleyball or bicycling or squatting, there's a linear relationship between force and velocity. Not a curved one like this, but a linear one. And so that would move peak power from here to here, which would correspond to about 50% of peak force and 50% peak velocity, not 1/3. This is something that's being researched quite a bit. We're not 100% sold on it because there is further research, like what this guy is doing. Peak power is achieved, at least in highly trained Olympic athletes, when the load is quite heavy, not when it's 1/3 or 1/2 of maximal force, right? Not when it's 1/3 of their 1 RM or 1/2 of their 1 RM, but when it's 80% of their 1 RM or 90% of their 1 RM. So there's a lot of interesting research on multi-joint power right now. And we're asking the question, which way does this curve, this blue curve, shift during multi-joint movements? A couple things to remember as you move on. Number one, each of the acute training variables affect each other. That's to say, when you change one, you change all of them. If you are prescribing a resistance training program, and you want to change intensity, well, guess what? If you do that, you've just changed volume as well. And you've also just changed rest periods. If you change one, you change all of them. When you introduce a new lift, you're going to have to alter training intensity and volume because they've never done it before. As practitioners, one of the most important concepts to carry with you is the SAID principle, which is the specific adaptations to imposed demands. It means that there's a reason that these guys look like this and act like this and play like this versus this woman here or these dudes here. It's that your body will adapt to the demands that you place on it. If you lift heavy and fast with high velocity, you're going to be strong and powerful. If you lift light and high volume, right, low loads and high volume, you're going to be able to gain a great amount of muscular stamina. Right? And so it also depends on the type of movements that you do, not just the intensity and volume, which is what I tend to stress, but also the angle of the movement. Right? Does a swimmer need to do bench press? Does swimming movements require great pectoral strength? Well, no, it just doesn't. Right? These rowers here, they're doing a lot of rowing movements in the gym, I guarantee it. A lot of push press and also lat pull and bent over rows to develop rowing strength, specific rowing strength. This ice skater is doing lots of things like lunges and rotational ab work, right? And a lot of single leg movements. This football player in the middle is doing a lot of fast bench press, powerful squats, Olympic lifting, so that he can push guys really hard in a very quick amount of time. Okay, time for the Matrix. And I do mean the Keanu Reeves Matrix, of course. This is the 4x4 matrix. What it tells you is the frequency, the intensity, the volume, and the rest that you would prescribe somebody if their main workout goal was to increase muscular power, or if their main goal was to increase strength, or increase hypertrophy, or increase muscular endurance. So if their main goal was to increase power, you would prescribe them a resistance training program in which they would train 1 to 2 times a week at 30 to 40% of their 1RM for single joint movements, or 75 to 90% for multi-joint movements, as we spoke of a couple slides before. The volume might be 1 to 2 or 3 to 4 reps at the low end, 3 to 5 sets on the high end, with rest intervals of 2 to 5 minutes. Note that the more intense, as we spoke of in the rest slides, the more intense you're lifting, the longer the rest needs to be. If the person's main goal is to increase strength, right? So if you've done the needs analysis and one of their goals is to increase strength, then they need to go 3 to 4 times per week, 75 to 85% of their 1RM, 6 rep range or lower because they're lifting heavy, high loads, 2 to 6 sets with 2 to 5 minutes of rest. Hypertrophy, 4 to 6 times per week, 60 to 75%, 6 to 12 repetitions within 3 to 6 sets with 30 to 90 seconds of rest. And finally, endurance. Right? Endurance gets the highest frequency, the lowest intensity, the highest volume, and the lowest rest periods. Question is, can you mix? And the answer is, we'll of course learn next week during the advanced program design lecture, that absolutely this is just a spectrum, and within one training program you might have a microcycle of 2 weeks in which you stress power, and you might have another microcycle right afterwards in which you stress endurance, and then you might have another microcycle of 2 weeks after that in which you stress hypertrophy, and then back to endurance for another couple of weeks, and then 2 weeks later you're doing power again. So that's the way that you use this matrix. It basically guides the microcycles that you prescribe within your macro cycle. Your macro cycle is your 12-month training program. Your microcycle is anything from 1 to 4 weeks within that macro cycle. You might have a microcycle where you stress one of these 4 training goals. And then you would use the matrix to help you prescribe the FIVR. Okay, so kind of wrapping up here a little bit. The needs analysis determines the goals of the program. Right, so you need to analyze that athlete top to bottom. Not only do you need to analyze their body, their height, and their weight, but you got to analyze the sport top to bottom. What energy systems are being stressed? What types of angular movements are being stressed? Is it high intensity, low intensity? Do they rotate a lot? Do they need to decelerate a lot? That determines the overall goals of the program. The goals of the program determine the implementation of acute program variables. Right? Are you using strength or hypertrophy or power? The implementation of acute program variables determines the responses and adaptations to resistance training. If you prescribe your exercises correctly, you will elicit the best adaptations. And finally, the responses and adaptations to resistance exercise influence athletic performance. So gaining strength or gaining hypertrophy or gaining stamina, gaining power helps them play better on their field of play, whether it's a marathon runner or a shot putter. Okay, so as we wrap up, just a quick summary of how you would prescribe resistance training for different experienced folks. So if the main goal is strength, gaining muscle strength, and you're working with somebody who's novice, you'd focus on single and multi-joint exercises with fairly low intensity, low loading, fairly high volume, 2 to 3 minutes of rest, and the repetition velocity would be controlled. Somebody who's experienced, you're going to get into multi-joint exercises with higher intensity, right, with lower volume range, And you're going to introduce some different speeds, different cadences within repetition velocity. If the goal is power and you're working with somebody who's novice, it's going to be multi-joint. We know that muscular power is maximized best with multi-joint exercises. Right? The intensity is going to be 80% of the 1RM. If you're focusing on increasing the strength, right, the force that they're imparting, the loading is going to be a little bit lower, perhaps, if you're trying to focus on the velocity component of power. The volume is going to be quite low in general. The rest period is going to be a little bit higher. And the repetition velocity is, of course, intentionally fast. If you're working with somebody experienced, of course, multi-joint, intensity is fairly stable and consistent. The rep range is again low, and the rest and repetition velocity is about the same. Hypertrophy for novices, single to multi-joint exercises, a little bit basic. Relatively moderate intensities and volume with lower rest and controlled repetition speeds. With experienced lifters, you can work out a little bit more intensely. You can drop the volume, of course. If you're increasing intensity, you're decreasing volume. And then into endurance for novice folks. You need to focus on single and multi-joint exercises. The intensity is going to be a little bit lower. The volume is going to be a little bit higher. Note here the rest is minimal. For experienced folks, emphasize multi-joint. We always want to emphasize multi-joint whenever we can. The intensity is going to be quite rangy. They can go low or high. Sets are going to be quite high, right? Volume is going to be quite high. Rest, still low, right? All right, so that's all I've got. That wraps up acute program variables. Next week, we will move on to advanced program variables.